Hello class 8. We will deal with the second half of the second chapter in biology, that is reproduction in plants. Today we will deal with sexual reproduction in plants. Part 1. We will talk about flowers, and if time permits we'll talk about pollination and different types of flowers. Okay? So for sexual reproduction, flowers play a very important role. Okay, so sexual reproduction is a common method of reproduction in flowering plants. Seeds are produced as a result of sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction over here means the union of the male and the female gametes. So if the male and the female gametes take part in a reproduction, this type of reproduction is called sexual reproduction. So the seeds are produced as a result of sexual reproduction, which germinate and grow into a new plant. Okay? Now we come to the structure of a flower. Now what is a flower? A flower are organs of reproduction in seed-bearing plants called angiosperms. So angiosperms are those the plants which produce flowers. Okay, so angiosperms are the type of plants which bears flowers and fruits. So the flowers are the organs of reproduction. So flower contains the male and the female gametes. And what is the function of the flower? The function of the flower is to form seeds. Why? Because the seeds can germinate and develop into a new plant. Okay? So flowers ultimately gives, after sexual reproduction, gives rise to seeds. All right. Now, we can see, I have drawn the diagram of a flower. This is the longitudinal section of a flower. You have a flower like this. We cut it into half. You will see a flower like this. That is called the longitudinal section. We have a flower. We cut it like this in a longitudinal section, and then we see the flower like this. Okay. This is the diagrammatic representation of the longitudinal section of a flower. Now, before we start the flower, there are 4 whorls, different parts, let's say. The 4 whorls of the flower. What are they? They are the calyx, corolla, androecium, and gynoecium. The calyx, the corolla, the androecium, and number 4, gynoecium. The calyx, the corolla, the androecium, and the gynoecium. Now let us talk about the calyx. Okay? The first whorl of the flower is called the calyx. Now, the calyx rests upon a round structure called the thalamus. This is the thalamus. This is the thalamus, the basal portion where all the 4 floral whorls rests is known as the thalamus. And we have the stalk of the flower. We have the stalk of the flower called pedicel. The stalk of the flower is known as pedicel. The stalk of the flower is called the pedicel. Okay, and after pedicel comes the basal portion where all the 4 whorls of the flower rests. That is called the thalamus. Now, the 4 floral whorls starts now. The calyx, the corolla, the androecium, and the gynoecium. Once more, the calyx, number 2, the corolla, the petal, the androecium, the male part of the flower, and the gynoecium, that is the female part of the flower. Okay? Now, the first part of the flower is known as the calyx or the sepals. It is made up of, calyx is made up of sepals. The leafy structure or the first whorl, the leafy structures are known as the sepal, and many sepals make up the structure called calyx. Now, what is the function of the calyx? Since the calyx is green color, usually they are green in color, it can manufacture food. Okay? Since it contains chlorophyll, it can manufacture food, and the calyx protects the flower during the bud stage. All the petals, the very tiny flower, the bud, is covered by the green leafy structures. These are the sepals. When you see a bud is always covered by the green leafy structures, and these are the sepals or the calyx. Okay, now we go to the next whorl, that is the second whorl, the corolla. And the corolla is made up of petals. Okay, the corolla is made up of petals, or the corolla. The corolla, or we can call it the petals. So now what is the function of the petals? Petals are usually brightly colored. Okay, in insect pollinated flower, they are brightly colored. Why? To attract insects for pollination. We'll come to that pollination later, you'll understand what it is. So petals will attract, since it is brightly colored, it will attract insects for pollination. And function number 2 is it will protect the inner whorls of the flower, the androecium and the gynoecium. The androecium is the male part of the flower and gynoecium is the female part of the flower. So it will cover the delicate androecium and the gynoecium. Okay, that is the function of the petals. Now, petals and the calyx in a flower, the calyx and the petals in the flower are called accessory whorls. It is not necessary, it is accessory whorls. Without calyx and the corolla, the function of the flower can be complete. So that is why the petals, they just help. Petals and the calyx, they just help the flower to protect the flower and to attract the insect. It does not directly, it is not direct, these are petals and the calyx and the corolla are not directly involved in the sexual reproduction. So that is why we called the corolla and the calyx accessory whorls. Okay, now the most important parts of the flower as far as sexual reproduction is concerned is the androecium, the male part of the flower. As you can see, there is a stalk, the male part of the flower. This is the androecium. Okay, this is the androecium. The whole structure is called the androecium, as you can see, the green one. So the stalk is known as the filament. The stalk of the androecium is known as the filament. And the round structure at the top of the filament is known as anther. Okay, the anther and the filament. So the anther and the filament makes up the male part of the flower called the androecium. The androecium, or the male part of the flower, or it is also known as stamen. It is also known as stamen. Okay, the male part of the flower or the stamen. Now, what is the function of the anther? Now, when we talk about the function of the anther, anther has a very important function, as it produces pollen grains. As it produces pollen, we must have heard about pollen. So it produces pollen grains. Okay, which contains the pollen grain. You must be wondering what pollen grain is. The pollen grains contains the male gametes. Okay, male sex cells or the male gametes, which is produced in the anther. So anther produces pollen grains, and pollen grains consists of male gametes, which is very, very important for sexual reproduction in a flower. Now, what is the function of the filament? The filament just holds the anther in the right place, okay? In the right place correctly. So that is the function of the filament. Now, the filament and the anther, as I told you, comprises the endoecium, which is also known as the stamen. Now, we come to the innermost whorl of the flower, the fourth whorl of the flower, that is the gynoecium, which is known as the gynoecium. Which is known as the gynoecium. This, the whole structure in the center, is, as you can see, this is the female part of the flower, which is known as the gynoecium. Now, what are the three parts of the gynoecium? This is the ovary. This is the ovary, the long portion over here, the stalk, sort of a structure here, is known as style. And the top flat portion is known as the stigma, which is known as a stigma, and together it comprises the gynoecium, or it is also known as carpel. It is also known as carpel, or it is also known as gynoecium. The gynoecium or carpel, which consists of the ovary, the style, and the stigma. Now, you must be wondering what the function of ovary is. The ovary produces female sex cells called ovules inside. We have female sex cells called ovules inside. So that is the function of the ovary. The ovary will produce, will carry ovules or the female gametes and protect it as well. Okay. Next is the style, which holds the flat structure called the stigma, and the function of the stigma is to receive the pollen grains, the pollen from the anther during pollination. You will understand it when we come to the next part after a while. So stigma is the flat structure, sticky structure. It could be hairy also, depending upon the flower. So a sticky structure, let's say, which receives pollen grains during pollination. That is the function of the stigma. Okay. Now, again, I want to repeat it. There are four floral whorls in a flower, the four parts in a flower. The first is the calyx. The first is the calyx. Then comes the corolla. The corolla consists of the petals. Then comes the third whorl from the outside, is known as the endoecium, and the fourth one, the innermost whorl, the female part of the flower, which is called the gynoecium or the carpel. Now, endoecium and gynoecium, since it produces male and the female gametes respectively, they are the essential whorls of the flower. They are called the essential whorls of the flower because without them, sexual reproduction cannot take place in a flower. Is it okay? So that is why the endoecium and the gynoecium here are called the essential whorls, whereas the calyx and the corolla, the petals and the sepals and the petals, they are called accessory whorls. It just helps in the sexual reproduction. It does not directly take part in it. Is it okay? Now, we come to another term as far as flower is concerned. We come to complete flower, and another term is incomplete flower. Now, what is a complete flower? A flower, as you can see the diagram here, it contains all the four floral whorls: the calyx, the corolla, the endoecium, and the gynoecium. The calyx, corolla, endoecium, and the gynoecium. All the four floral whorls are present in a flower. This type of a flower is called complete flower. Okay. Now, complete flower can be bisexual. Complete flower can be bisexual. Bisexual means a flower which contains both the androecium as well as the gynoecium, the stamen as well as the carpel. The stamen as well as the carpel, that is called a complete flower as well as a bisexual flower. A complete flower is a flower which contains all the 4 floral whorls, and bisexual flower are those which contains both the male part and the female part, the stamen and the carpel. So complete flower are always bisexual flowers. Understood? The examples: hibiscus, rose, petunia. You must have heard about these flowers. You must have seen it. So hibiscus, rose, petunia, these are complete flower as well as bisexual flowers. Now we come to the incomplete flower. Incomplete flower means any one. If any one of the 4 floral whorls, the calyx, the corolla, the androecium and gynoecium are missing, any one or more floral whorls are missing, then it is called incomplete flower. Okay, they are called incomplete flower. Now, incomplete flower can be unisexual. Unisexual means a flower which contains either the androecium or the gynoecium, not both. If we have both, it is called bisexual flower. It is unisexual means it consists of only either gynoecium or either the androecium. This type of flower is known as unisexual flowers. So a flower which contains only the stamen, the flower which contains only the stamen is called staminate flower. It is called the staminate flower or the male flower. So a flower which contains only the stamen or the androecium is called the staminate flower or the male flower, while a flower which contains among the androecium and gynoecium, it contains only the gynoecium or the carpel, is known as a female flower. It is known as the female flower. Is it okay? Or we call it a piscillate flower. Okay, a piscillate flower. It consists of pistil. We call it pistil here also. P-I-S-T-I-L. Or a pistil or piscillate flower. Is it okay? Staminate flower and the piscillate flower. The flower which contains the stamen is called the staminate flower. The flower which causes the gynoecium or the pistil is known as the piscillate flower. Example: papaya and maize are the unisexual flower. And now we come neuter flower, a flower which is neutral, does not contain any of the two a flower which does not contain the androecium as well as the gynoecium. That means it is a neutral flower. It does not contain the stamen and the pistil or the carpel. Okay, so if the flower does not contain both the androecium or the gynoecium, it is called a neutral flower. For example, ray florets of a sunflower. All right, now we come to pollination, a very, very important pollination is very, very important for sexual reproduction to take place. It's the first step in sexual reproduction in a flower. Okay, now what is pollination? Okay, now pollination. What is pollination? So actually pollination is simply the transfer of pollen grains from the anther. Anther, as I told you, contains pollen grains. Now for sexual reproduction to take place, the pollen grains must get transferred from the anther to the stigma. Okay, now pollen grains always get transferred from the anther to the stigma, and this process of the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma by various methods, it is known as pollination. All right. Now there are two types. When we talk about pollination, there are two types of pollination. It's called the self-pollination and the cross-pollination. Self-pollination self-pollination and cross-pollination. The self-pollination and the cross-pollination. Now what is it? I'll tell you the first one, the self-pollination. The self-pollination is the transfer. Please listen to it carefully. Self-pollination is the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or of another flower borne by the same plant. Is it okay? So, if you do not understand what a self-pollination is, I'm going to tell you here by a simple diagrammatic representation. We have a flower here, all right? We have another flower here, and we have the anther and the stigma. We have the anther and the stigma. Now, borne by the same plant. Okay. Now, what is self-pollination? The self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or from the anther to the stigma of another flower borne by the same plant. So this is called the self-pollination. Once more, self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma, obviously, of the same flower, or the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower borne by the same plant. This is called self-pollination. And next is cross-pollination. The next one is cross-pollination. So what is cross-pollination? So cross-pollination is the type of pollination that takes place between the two different flowers of two different plants. Pollination that takes place between the two different flowers but of the same species. So cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower borne by another plant but of the same species. So that is called cross-pollination. So cross-pollination, there is a difference between the comparison between the self-pollination and the cross-pollination. So self-pollination, it occurs within a flower or between two flowers of the same plant. So self-pollination takes place between the flowers of the same plant, whereas during cross-pollination it occurs between the two different flowers but of the same plant, of the different plant but of the same species. Next is, in self-pollination usually no external agents of pollination will be required. Whereas in a cross-pollination, external agents such as wind, water, insects, birds and animals can be needed during cross-pollination. So these are the external agents. We will deal with that in the next class. So the external agents will be required for pollination, like external agents like the wind, insects, water, birds and animals. Next is the self-pollination. In self-pollination, pollen grains are produced in small numbers. Small pollen grains are needed in small numbers. That means there is no wastage of pollen grains. But if a flower has to cross-pollinate, then a flower, the anther, needs to produce a lot of pollen grains, and there will be a lot of wastage of pollen grains. And the last one is, the flower is usually not attractive. If those flowers which self-pollinate, they need not be brightly colored because they need not attract external agents like insects and birds and animals. Okay, so the self-pollinated flowers are usually not very, very attractive. Whereas cross-pollination, those flowers in which cross-pollination takes place, they need to be attractive, to attract brightly colored, and they produce scent and so on. Why? Because they have to attract the external agents like the animals, the birds and the insects. So these are the difference between the cross-pollination and self-pollination. So in the next class, we are going to deal with different agents of pollination, and we will talk about artificial pollination, fertilization, seed formation, and fruit formation. So this much for today. I hope you understood. Have a good day.